Thank you very much. Ooh. And I hope everybody managed to grab some LSD in the toilet. I'm sure that you need it after this day. So thank you very much, and thank you for having me here this evening. It's a great pleasure. So my name is Gilad Baram, and I'm an image maker. And tonight I would like to share with you a story about a film that was never meant to become, and the encounter that gave birth to it, and as the infamous TED sentence says, changed my life. So it was about 10 years ago that I was a student of photography, starting my second year at the Art Academy in Jerusalem. And that's where I first met Josef Koudelka. He was my first photographic hero, and I met him on the classroom on the wall while he was projected there. I remember the day very well. My professor entered the class, dimmed the light. The projector went on, and there was this kind of silence in the classroom. And then these photographs, these black and white photographs, very contrastic photographs, started appearing on the wall. These were amazing photographs of men and women that went out to the streets of Prague in the summer of 1968 and grabbed whatever they could into their hands and stood in front of those Soviet soldiers that were on those tanks and were, protesting. I was so amazed by those photographs. They were so poignant and so dramatic and so full of anger. And I remember very well, especially the last photograph of that series. The last photograph was this one. It was a wristwatch indicating the time, forever frozen, in which the Soviet tanks were about to enroll into the capital city. So with that photo in mind, as the projection ended, I grabbed all my things and I ran to the library and I started pulling out all the books that I could of Josef Koudelka. So the first book that came out of the shelf was a book called Gypsies. This was a book that depicts in amazing, masterful eye photographs the lives of Roma communities in East Europe in the 60s and in the 70s. I remember being sucked into that kind of photographic world that Koudelka created for himself there. And then I went on to another book. That book was called Exiles. And it depicted an exile way of being, as Koudelka had to leave in 1970 Czechoslovakia and went into exile in West Europe and produced a very personal, a very emotional body of work that then came out in this book. And last were these books called Chaos and Black Triangle, Lime, these books that they depicted landscapes that were kind of manipulated and harmed by human beings. So sitting back there in the library, I couldn't imagine what would happen to me 1 year later. So Josef arrived in Israel and Palestine in 2008. He arrived as part of a group of 12 photographers. Among them were names like Jeff Wall, Stephen Shore, Thomas Strutt, Rosalind Fox-Solomon. And this project was initiated by a photographer named Frédéric Brenner, a French photographer. He had this ambitious idea of bringing this group of photographers to Israel and allowing them to be there for an extensive amount of time, giving them all the infrastructure possible in order to each create an individual project that would then become a group exhibition and a group of monographs and will travel the world. At the very beginning, Koudelka stood up in front of Brenner and announced that the project that he's going to make is going to be about Israeli and Palestinian landscape with a special emphasis on the wall built by Israel in the West Bank. Now, Koudelka arrived first time to Israel at 2008. It was a kind of tour that Brenner was organizing, and he came there and was taken around, and only in the last 2 days he was taken to East Jerusalem. There he saw the wall. The wall at that point, you should understand, is an incredible monument. It's a 9-meter high wall, concrete. It stretches through a very vast space. And when seeing that wall, it struck a very deep chord in Koudelka. Koudelka, as a child, grew up in Czechoslovakia under German occupation, and then later on as a young man under Soviet occupation, and of course, behind the barrier, behind the Iron Curtain. So he knew very well what walls were about and how they affect people's lives. So that's basically how we met for the second time, but this time face to face. Yes, so how did that happen? Well, the project was doing a cooperation with the Art Academy, with my school. This was on the basis of students becoming assistants to these photographers that would arrive to Israel while they were doing their projects in the region. And, well, this was part of the project infrastructure, and it so happened that Koudelka was the first photographer to arrive, and I was the first student to be picked out of a group of students. So we were basically thrown into a car and drove off to an adventure that neither of us really knew how it's going to end. So only 2 days after we started this journey together, it took only 2 days for me to realize a very, very harsh truth, that the last thing that Josef Koudelka needs is an assistant. So he needed a driver, he needed somebody to translate for him, he needed somebody perhaps to buy the sandwiches and have it under a tree somewhere, but definitely not an assistant. He's kind of this lone wolf that works alone completely. So after a few days, I was there becoming more and more frustrated, and it kind of dawned on me that unless I find something for myself to do by myself, I will not really manage to last very long in this project. And when attempting, I did something that probably most photography students did, as I thought to myself, I must do something. I brought my camera with me. When I first attempted to take the camera out and start photographing myself, Koudelka, try to imagine this. We were in this village in the north of the West Bank. We would usually, how it went, we would drive, we would stop the car, Koudelka would jump out, take his camera, disappear for 2 hours and come back. And this time, Koudelka jumped out of the car, but I had my camera with me, jumped out after him and started photographing. Now, when he saw me doing that, he turned to me and he said in a very harsh voice, "No, no way. You're not going to hang around me with the camera. Leave it in the car." You can imagine I was rather shocked, but I was, of course, his assistant, and an assistant does what a master tells him to do. So I left the camera in the car, but as he was disappearing, I was kind of thinking to myself, imagining this conversation in my mind, in which I would turn to Koudelka at the end of the day and I would tell him, "Mr. Koudelka, it's been a great honor being with you, but I will not continue." I'm very lucky to have had another voice in my mind. That voice was a bit more kind of quiet and said, maybe that's a bit too presumptuous. It kind of told me, perhaps you should try another way. So as Josef came back, we went into the car, went on to the next location, and the ritual went again. He would step out of the car, but I had that moment in which I had to make a decision. And that decision was to take the camera again. And that's what I did. So Koudelka is out there, and I'm taking my camera, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and there's complete silence between us. And then, surprisingly, he just walks away and doesn't say anything. And that's when something started. So, yeah, I've never seen anybody photographing like this. I was completely mesmerized. I could never imagine that Josef Koudelka, that I took all the books out in the library and looked at his photographs, that this is how he photographs. You know, back then, what I had in my hands was a camera. It was a 5D Mark II. And it had a very special feature. That feature was a very high-definition video file. Today, of course, every camera has it. But back then, in 2009, this was completely new. And that kind of movement, that kind of dance, is what I found the most fascinating. I couldn't get my eyes off Koudelka. And suddenly, holding that camera, making photographs, it made a lot of sense to switch that little dial to the video mode, as that kind of corresponded so well with that incredible movement. And that's what I did. I switched from the stills mode to the video mode and basically started making these short clips that with time would become longer and longer and longer. So it's very important to mention at this point, Koudelka came to Israel throughout 4 years, from 2009 to 2012. 2008, he had this small excursion, but 2009, he actually started this project. And as my great advantage, while we would work these times, we would work in these 4 years. We had Koudelka came for 7 visits. In each of these visits, he would come for about 3 to 4 weeks, and in each of these weeks, we would work from morning till night. Koudelka always said, a photographer must work as long as there's light. So that's what we did. But my big advantage were these times in which Koudelka was not there. We had something in average like 5 to 6 months in which Koudelka was away, and I could go and kind of visit my material, have a look at it and kind of learn what disasters I was making. At first, I had a handheld camera. I was running around him. I was trying to get him from many different angles. It was a complete chaos. But when I could sit and watch that, and as his project was going throughout this long period of time, I could also learn and improve myself from time to time. Now, what I realized is that if I am to try and depict Koudelka and the way that he's working, which is what interests me the most, that creative process of a photographer, then I must start learning from him in order to learn of him. So I started slowing down. I started trying to imitate the way that he moves, to study it very closely, and that master-assistant way of imitating in order to learn. I also started putting my camera on a tripod. I did that not because Josef Koudelka did it, but because I realized it's the language of still photography that I must apply on my moving image in order to try and document and depict a photographer photographing. So gradually I started to understand this, and one of my biggest assets, not only the fact that Josef was away, one of my biggest assets was also the fact that Koudelka didn't give a damn about what I was doing. Josef basically needed me around. He needed me for the reasons I mentioned before. But he didn't care what I was doing and how I was doing it. So I had that complete freedom to be there with my camera, observe him, and kind of catch a Koudelka that nobody has really caught before, a very genuine Koudelka, a very careless and very kind of natural one in his habitat, which is making photographs. So I'll share with you another clip from the film.
What a shit. All people can do something like that, beautiful landscape. It's on both sides. They can defend or try to defend. They don't have much chances either. But the landscape can't defend it. And that destroying it is the most holy landscape for civilization forever. Nobody can put it back how it was. Nobody.
So Koudelka is not an easy protagonist, I can tell you that. He's not a protagonist that gives himself away very easily. What I learned later on as we were having our journey together is that at the very beginning, Koudelka actually thought I'm a Mossad agent and that I'm there to keep an eye on him in order to prevent him from doing something he's not supposed to do or seeing something he's not supposed to see. I learned also that that kind of mentality is something that is very typical for people that grew up in the East Bloc and behind the Iron Curtain. So trust was not an easy thing to get with Josef Koudelka. But I think that point in which things started changing is when Koudelka realized that I, as much as him, but even more, am extremely affected from what we're seeing. From the places we were visiting, from the people that we met, and that this wall has affected their lives. I kind of learned to, and came to the realization what my society was doing, what my government was doing, and what it does to others. So step by step, from that point on, things started to change, and our trust started to be built between us, a kind of bridge. You know, so if it started with him asking me to leave the camera in the car, it ended with him asking me from which side of the frame to enter. So after 4 years, I had 130 hours of material, and with the help of the wonderful editor Elisa Purfust, a film started to emerge out of this material. Koudelka Shooting Holy Land, a film that was never meant to become, was released in 2015 and has since traveled to over 50 countries, has been broadcast in many TV stations and won prizes. I never thought I would ever become a filmmaker, but just 4 months ago, I premiered my second film at the Berlin Film Festival, a film that was made together with artist Adam Kaplan, and I'm now moving on towards my third film. So the meeting with Koudelka did not only produce a film and did not only change my life so profoundly when I met that hero that I always imagined myself becoming, but it also ended with a wonderful relationship, and a relationship I never imagined that could happen, and with me realizing and slowly understanding how to shape my own point of view. So once Koudelka surprised me by telling me something that I never thought I would ever hear from him. Of course, it was said ironically, but he said, you know, I need to be very thankful for those Soviet soldiers who occupied my country. I need to be very thankful because without that, my life would be completely different. But of course, it wasn't the Warsaw Pact that he needed to thank. It was his own self, his own 30-year-old self, that in the middle of the night took his camera, went out to the streets of Prague, confronted those tanks and those soldiers, and made a body of work that impacted not only his life, but also the lives of many others. So this is probably the most important lesson that I take with me from that adventure with Josef Koudelka. It is the lesson of how never to give up, how never to listen to that voice in you that tells you you should stop. You should always choose to do, always choose to see. And as Koudelka told me, he said, I reacted. Just imagine if I wouldn't. Thank you very much.